All right. Well, Professor, I really appreciate you being on.
Sure.
A chance to pick your brain. You've been one of my favorite professors at the school. You always have super engaging, lectures and whatnot. And I'm really excited to get going here. But
Sure.
before we do, why don't you just like explain a little bit about what exactly your profession is, what your area of expertise is, and like
Sure.
I don't know what you study in general, I guess.
Yeah, sure. So, well, first of all, thanks for having me. I think this is a great idea. I'm a big fan of podcasts in general, and I think we've had some good conversations in the past, and I think you're a good conversationalist, and I think hopefully this will be a successful podcast with lots of listeners, and it's an honor to be on. So thanks for inviting me. And it's kind of you to say that that you've enjoyed my classes. I mean, I really enjoyed having you in classes. We can get into some of that maybe, in our conversation, because I've seen some a sort of I don't know what you'd call it, a growth kind of in you,
Mhm.
over time, and it's been interesting. That's part of what we've had conversations about in the past. But yeah, so I'm a political scientist. I have a PhD in political science from Purdue University. I did my undergraduate work in political science also, but I also have a degree in philosophy. So
Uh,
I first went to graduate school to study political theory, which is basically political philosophy, but in the political science field. Um, but then for a variety of reasons, I switched when I was in grad school. One was that there just aren't that many jobs in political theory,
that's fair.
sadly, because I think it's a really important subfield. But, a
Mhm.
lot of places think, well, if we have to cut something or if we have to do away with something, we can do away with political theory because, the college has philosophers. So lots of places don't even have a political theorist. In fact, the first place I worked, which was Old Dominion University, we didn't have a theorist in my political science department. So I taught some theory classes, but there wasn't a full-time theorist. Fortunately, here at F&M, we have two full-time theorists in our department because we think it's a really important part of the curriculum. Um, so I switched then in grad school to study American politics, which I was also really interested in, and I had worked on some campaigns as an undergrad and in graduate school, and was very interested in elections, campaigns, and elections. So I switched into American politics and did a dissertation on the role of political consultants in congressional elections,
Mhm.
and so whether they helped candidates, gain votes or win elections or not. Um, and so, yeah, that's so from there, I just, I've been studying American politics and some version of campaigns and elections ever since. I do a lot of research on political parties and things like that. So, yeah, that's
Okay, yeah, that's awesome. And I know that you wrote a book called "In Defense of Politicians." That was back in
yeah,
2013, I believe.
right. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And obviously, an opinion that I guess that title in itself could scare some people today.
Yeah.
Even more so today than it did then.
No, I
You
think you're
know,
right. I know. I think it might be a harder argument to make today than
certainly. But
but yeah,
yeah,
yeah. No, it's a little bit contrarian, but I wanted to kind of make the point that I think a lot of what people say. You might hear my dog in the background. I'm sorry. I
no,
have
it's
a
okay.
lab, and she gets when she sees the groundhogs in the backyard, she gets worked up. So sorry. She might join the conversation at some point.
That would be awesome.
But yeah, so the book was just basically saying, like, look, most of what you think about politicians in general probably isn't true. It might be true for a handful or some politicians,
Mhm.
but in general, I think they probably deserve some respect, because
Right,
they do a job that's necessary for our democracy, and I don't think they
right.
get enough credit for kind of putting themselves out there, because when they
Hmm.
run for office, they're kind of an open book,
Certainly.
their past is open for scrutiny, their family's open for scrutiny, everything they say, everything they do gets scrutinized, and it's
Mhm.
not an easy thing to do.
Right. Yeah. Certainly. And I read some of it. And I found it really interesting. I mean, do you think your view has shifted since then at all? Based
Not,
on.
not really. I mean, I still think that, in fact, if anything, really, to be honest, the argument is probably even more relevant now.
Okay.
After, the elephant in the room here is Trump, right? The Trump
Right.
presidency.
Right.
But part of my argument was like, look, when you just expect that politicians are going to be scoundrels, right? And
Mhm.
again, this is pre-Trump.
Mhm.
But there was just a lot of that in the United States. There's just a kind of a hatred of politicians. They're the butt of all kinds of jokes, right, and all kinds of stuff. And when you just basically say, we're not going to collectively, we're not going to give any respect to people who run for office. Well, then who would run for office? The people who are going to run for office probably are scoundrels, right? So part of the argument was like, if we give them a little bit more respect, we can disagree with them. We absolutely should disagree with them. But if we gave them respect for running for office in the first place, maybe it would be more respectable to do it, and maybe more respectable people would run. And so, I think Trump is sort of capitalized on this idea that, oh, well, it doesn't matter. They all lie. They're all corrupt. So, okay, so maybe Trump lies some or maybe a lot, but what's the difference, right? Everybody does it. And the part of the book, I mean, the main reason for the book was to say, actually, they don't lie very often. Like, yeah, sure, there's some stretching of the truth and spinning, but of course we do that in our own everyday lives too, right? People do that all the time. And so they're not that different from us. And so, if we could recognize that, maybe we'd get better politicians. So I think the argument still stands.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. And as I was reading it, one kind of thing I picked up on is you seem to have an aura of like gratitude towards our system, towards politics in general, for where we are as a society. And you say, we often we're cynical, and that cynicism can be a threat to our democracy. And that's certainly something that I find like throughout our culture today. And I'm a big fan of this guy. His name is Jordan Peterson. But I don't know if you know who he is, but
Yeah, I do.
yeah, I mean, he has a lot of he has a political side to him, but I'm more interested in a lot of his research. And he wrote a book called 12 Rules for Life, and one called like it was called 12 Rules for Life: An Antidote to Chaos. And kind of what it is within a society or within an individual, like when you're trying to put your life together, it's really good to begin with an order of gratitude for where you are, even if it doesn't matter like what point of your life you're in. And because that kind of gives you a little bit of perspective. Because if you're just cynical, you start with from a cynical point of view. It's kind of hard to improve on that. But almost in the same sense, some would argue that we live in somewhat of a broken society. I wouldn't go that far, but I'd say there's definitely aspects of it that are unhealthy. And do you think that message of gratitude that you found in your book, that you tried to get at in your book, is something that could kind of help us maybe come back together in some way? I think it's kind of hard to tell exactly where our divisions are, whether they are really ideological,
Right.
or whether they're just in the type of leaders that we're electing.
Right.
And you reference at one point, we elect people who won't budge because, like, as there's all this lack of movement in Congress. A lot of it is due to the fact that we're like, oh well, we need better leaders. We need people who are gonna push forward and like make agreements and whatnot. But what that really means is a lot of time is we're actually just looking for somebody who represents our ideology in a perfect way, and it doesn't represent and it's you're not willing to budge. You're not really willing to cross party lines, but it's almost as if we want like somebody almost in a dictatorial sense,
Right.
but just to represent exactly what we believe in.
Exactly. No, that's right. Yeah. So I had identified in that book a couple of traps that we lay for politicians, and one of them is this trap that we want them to kind of simultaneously be leaders and followers, right? So, we say like, don't just follow, public opinion polls. Like that's not leadership, right? So do what you think is right. Then as soon as a politician does what they think is right and it's not popular with their constituents, right? Then they run them out of town, right? And they're angry because they say, well, what I want you to do is lead by doing what I think is right, right?
Right.
And it's like, well, it can't be both ways. We either have to give them a little bit of space to lead, and that sometimes means that they're going to do things that we disagree with, or not. We could have a system where we just say, listen, just do exactly what we want, like a rubber stamp of public opinion. But that's not really that. But then that's not leadership, right? And so we have to decide what we want out of our politicians. I mean, a lot of what I was saying in that book is we just don't have clear standards for what we want, and so we hold them to sort of contradictory standards often. You know what I mean?
What do you mean by that? Like clear standards?
Well, we don't have an expectation of what we'd like politicians to be, right? So another trap we lay for them is we want them to be kind of. I mean, elections are aristocratic by nature, because what they are picking people to be the representatives, And, if we wanted to have a pure democracy, we would have kind of a direct democracy, right? But we can't have that for a bunch of reasons. And so initially elections were like, look, we're going to choose the best among us to be our representatives. And that's what aristocracy really means, right? Rule by the best. And so, we kind of want our politicians to be better than us in a lot of ways, probably more honest, probably smarter, probably more experienced, right? Have more integrity, all kinds of stuff. But then we don't like them to be elitists, right? We want them to be an average Joe. We want to be the person we'll have a beer with, right? But again, it's hard to be both of those things, right? You can't really be, and I don't even take a position on what we should have, one or the other, but we ought to just kind of get our heads straight about what we want them to be. Do we want them to be better than the rest of us, or just like the rest of us? Do we want them to lead us even in times when we don't really want to go that direction? Or do we want them just to follow our instructions as their bosses in a way, right? We just don't know. So we do these contradictory things. And it's like, I mean, I don't know if I tell this story in the book, but Jimmy Carter, when he was president, would carry his own bags. Like he would just carry his luggage, off the plane. And people hated it. They were like, he's the president of the United States. This just looks too like, like some guy jumping on a Greyhound bus, like, well, but that's kind of there's something refreshing about that, right? It's kind of, he's like, look, I can do it myself. But we're not clear what we want,
Right.
As soon as a politician starts acting like they're a little bit better than us, then we knock them down to size, right?
Yeah, that makes
So
sense.
I guess what, and to bring this back to kind of your point about gratitude, I guess I just feel like what we have in society now, and I don't know if this is driven by social media or what, but we're just so quick to pounce on people, for all kinds of stuff. And sometimes they deserve to be pounced on, right? Sometimes people make really bad decisions and they have to be held accountable for them. But sometimes people just make mistakes, and it's like, give them a little bit of, have a little bit of grace, right? And give people a little bit of a break. And we're not willing to do that at all,
No, I certainly agree with that. And maybe to push back a little bit on like what we look for in politicians, I almost see sometimes we almost want people who we can demonize. I think there's almost a drive to demonize the other side right now, because it makes ourselves feel better about where we stand. And I think a lot of the time the right gets like this fear mongering type. They get a reputation for fear mongering, but I mean, honestly, I think I see it really on both sides. I think it's just done in different ways. Would you agree with that? Do you think that? I mean, it's almost as if part of us wants our current state to be dysfunctional, because dysfunction. We have a little bit of a drive towards chaos within us. I think.
Right.
I don't know. Do you see that as well?
Yeah. So these are really good questions, and these are, I mean, they're really getting at the heart of what we're dealing with now as a society, but also as a polity, right? As a political system. So I guess I always want to be careful about sort of both sidism, right? I mean, if we're going to say both sides are doing it, we want to be sure they're doing it to the same degree, and also in the same manner, in the same way, right? Because they may be doing things similarly, but there's important differences. And we could try to diagnose both the left and the right to see if they are in fact doing the same kind of thing. But in general, I agree with you that they are doing the same sort of thing, because it is, I mean, this is what in political science we call negative partisanship, right? Where it's not so much that you think my side's right and I love my side. It's mostly what we're driven by nowadays is the other side is not only wrong, but evil. And, if you ask people on both sides, I mean, if the real passionate people on both sides really do believe that the other side is evil, and they may be right. I mean, one side may be right and the other side wrong, right? But you ask people on the left and they think, look, people on the right really don't care about people's equality or about people's suffering or their plight in the world, right? But then people on the right think, well, look, people on the left, they just want to kind of ruin what is traditionally good about the United States, right? They want to transform it into something completely different. Now, the left might agree with that and think that what is going to be different is going to be better, but that's threatening to people on the right. I mean, they have conservatives, are worried about upsetting the status quo, sometimes irrationally, but sometimes rationally, because they think, I don't know if we're going to replace the status quo, what are we going to replace it with?
Mm-hmm.
So these are real threats to people, right? On the left, that people think like, look, if we don't change some of these things, like really deeply embedded racism and sexism, then people are not only are they not equal in a democracy, but they're not fully free to sort of live the lives that they envision for themselves. And after all, the United States is about freedom, right? So yeah, I mean, again, I think we if we really dig deep here, we might see differences in the way the left and the right think about the other side. But I think in general, you're right that there is this there's a deep distrust, right? And so when you talk about gratitude, it's like you can't have gratitude for somebody that you don't trust, that you think actually has not doesn't have your well-being in mind, but maybe even worse, might want to harm you, right?
Right. Yeah. And yeah, I think I totally agree on that. In some sense, I almost think a lot of the current race issues, as far as what you said, there's certain systems within our country that limit the freedom that individuals of certain races have. And I know you talk about in one of your books, Campaigns and Elections, this kind of difference between, conservatives and Republicans are usually on the side of like freedom in general. And, the left, Democrats are usually on the side of, equality. And my personal view has kind of, I used to be more conservative, but my current view is more of, I think we need both. And I think even in, I believe one of the classes that I took with you, we learned about, there's a psychology to both sides. Like you can actually look at somebody's psychology and almost make an educated guess on which side of the aisle they're going to be.
Yeah.
And I think that's important in identifying, because I think you need people on both sides. You need people who are more open to change, more open to new things, more open to changes within society. And then you also need people who are like, hey, sometimes we're going a little bit too far.
Right.
And I think that that's a really important balance. But I would agree that oftentimes with the right, I'm a little bit I've become more libertarian on some sense, because I really do like freedom and whatnot. I don't know, like I don't really like when people tell me like how to live my life or whatever. And there seems to be a little bit of an inconsistency as far as the way in which that has been, especially with social issues on the right. They seem to be more,
right.
There is a little bit more of an authoritarian strain as far as it goes, telling you what who you can marry, or telling you, what you can put in your body and things like that. But
yeah, no, that's right. And I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think,
yeah,
you're right. I mean, I think, the right claims to be about freedom, but I think if you really look at the history of conservatism in the United States, it's only partially about freedom, right? It's mostly freedom in the economic realm, but not really in the social realm. Whereas on the left, they're interested in freedom too, but mostly in the social realm, right? And not so much in the economic realm, although their argument would be that, the economic policies they favor, in attempting to achieve some level of equality, will also open up freedoms for people, right? If you're poor, you're not free to vacation or free to travel or something like that, right? So or take time off work or whatever it might be. So so there's this weird kind of mix in the United States in our political culture where both sides do care a lot about freedom, and yet not entirely. And I think you're right that on the right there's a lot more sort of order, that they're classical conservatives going way back, starting with Edmund Burke in in Britain, were mostly about order. It was just like, let's maintain order. Like, and anything that's going to upset status quo is going to upset order. And so that's where you get that fear on the right, I think, of change, right? So one thing that's pretty true about conservatives is they're not real crazy about radical change, right? And the reason is because that's this part of their ideology that's about order. I mean, we can go into that. There's a lot more to say about that kind of stuff. We can go into it if you want, but I did want to say one thing about you raised that issue of personality and the connection between personality and ideology. I mean, here again, I think, give people a little bit of a break. And if you understand that where they're coming from is probably to some extent hardwired, right? I mean, I don't really think well, I don't know. I'm not a personality psychologist, so I don't know for sure. But my sense is that a lot of personality is kind of genetically based and hardwired. And if you are just predisposed in terms of your disposition, in terms of your personality, to be a little bit more conservative or a little bit more liberal, it would be very, very hard to change that, if even, it may not even be possible at all, right? So if we all came to the table saying, okay, I believe what I believe for very deep reasons that I can't even articulate, and so do you, and that doesn't make you bad, it just makes you who you are, and it makes me who I am, and let's sort of acknowledge one another's humanity, and that we're coming at this for some environmental reasons, right? The way we were raised or the people we hang out with, but also for some deep kind of personality, genetic kind of reasons, right? I think, that might help to go a long way to say, okay, I disagree with your ideas, but let's talk about the ideas. And I think where you're coming from is a human predisposition.
Right. Yeah. It's very deep within ourselves. And I would certainly agree with that. And one issue I've had with the left recently, it's almost as if both, I guess in general, both sides have had a problem with it, is authority seems to be the notion on both sides, with, as far as the left, with censorship. I mean, there seems to be a lot more censorship by these big tech organizations towards people who are on the right. And a lot of times it's people who are on the fringe, but a lot of times there's people who are on the fringe on the left who don't face that same censorship. And my personal view is, what happened to liberals being more in favor of free speech? That used to be kind of their crunching point. And I've seen a kind of a deterioration of it, and almost since the Trump era, and even more so in the last year, I've seen authoritarian tendencies increase on both sides. Maybe I'm incorrect on that, but that just seems to be the way in which it is.
Yeah. So I think I know what you're getting at, but I also think, this is a kind of a paradox in a democracy, I think, right? To what extent do you allow anti-democratic things to be said and done, right, in the name of democracy? Look, January 6th, I think was a really dangerous thing. And that's when Twitter said, when they banned Trump. It wasn't before that. It was, he's inciting an insurrection. And do we just allow him to use a platform? And keep in mind, this also, what's complicated here is it's a private company, right? It's not the government, but it's a private company saying, look, you're not going to use our platform to undermine democracy. We flourish in a democracy. And if what you're saying is not just disagreeable to us, but is actually potentially undermining democracy, then we're going to have to shut it down. Now, who gets to decide that? This gets really tricky. I don't know that I want, Twitter making that call. But on the other hand, it seemed like an emergency, and it seemed like a time when maybe shutting somebody down was justified. It's a tough call, though. Now, that may be the extreme example, right? And there may be lots of other ways where if people say something that's deemed to be racist or sexist and they get kind of, shut down. But I'm not sure of all the times that Twitter or Facebook have shut somebody down, whether it's been, I don't know how many examples of just sort of, a random racist statement where they've then been shut down. But at least when it comes to democracy and support for democracy, that seems to me to be a different kind of magnitude. But even with kind of the cancel culture stuff, right? Look, the CPAC, right? The conservative political conference, right? Disinvited that rapper, right, who had said a bunch of anti-Semitic stuff in the past. So the whole idea of this conference was like, oh, we got to speak out against cancel culture, and yet they
Cancel
disinvite this
somebody.
guy for saying something,
Right.
right? Because
Right.
everybody has their line where they say, okay, you can't cross this line. We don't want to be associated with you. We're a private entity. We're Twitter, or we're CPAC, or we're whoever, and or we're a business, and we don't want our brand, we don't want our, our whatever it is, our image, to be associated with people who are saying things that we don't like. Now, when it's Twitter or Facebook, that's a huge platform, right?
Mhm.
But, I don't know. I guess I don't see it as that threatening. I mean,
Okay.
there's still lots of people out there making lots of arguments that people find offensive. There are platforms now, certainly, for them to do that, right?
Yeah. I think I agree with part of that, but I also, I have a little bit of a hesitation when it comes to I think simply beginning to censor people can lead down a path that it just, I don't know, we increasingly push back the mold. We push back the mold a little bit. It started as just a few years ago. I remember when like Alex Jones got canceled,
Yeah, yeah.
and now everybody today would agree, yeah, of course, that's something we can all kind of agree on. But what I've seen as a trend increasingly is, I've seen people on YouTube who really aren't that politically right. Like they're just kind of mainstream conservatives being demonetized for simply supporting things that Donald Trump said, um, or just simply, questioning certain narratives within the media.
Yeah.
And I think that's just it can be a slippery slope to go down
Mhm.
that. And
Yeah, no, no,
and
no. I agree with that. That's why I said, like, I'm not comfortable. I mean, I just for the record, I think Twitter made the right call on Trump after the insurrection on the 6th. But I also, at the same time, am very uncomfortable with them making decisions like that. I mean, he's the duly elected president of the United States, right? But what happens if, I mean, let's just take it to a hypothetical, right? I mean, and this is not that hypothetical because it happened in Hungary, it happened in it's happening in Poland. I mean, they were democracies that are now not really democracies anymore, because the parties that got a foothold in power began to undermine all kinds of other parts of the democracy, the courts, the media, elections, can't protest. I mean, I don't know that if the New York Times article the other day, that there are a number of Republican-led state legislatures that are making it nearly impossible to protest. So, if so, again, this is paradoxical, because it's like, in the name of freedom and democracy, we may have to not allow some activity and some speech that is undermining democracy. But to some extent, I guess that's what those Republican legislatures are arguing, right? There's certain kinds of protests that we can't allow because they lead to violence, and that would undermine our democracy. But I don't know. This is where that both siderism is so dangerous, because it's like, okay, because both sides are saying you can't say that or you can't do that, are they equally legitimate claims? And I'm not sure they are. I mean, but having said all that, I am worried that, do we want to let Jack Dorsey make the call for us?
right.
Is he the one who's going to be the arbiter of what is allowed and what isn't in our democracy? That makes me really uncomfortable too. And it should make everybody uncomfortable, because, today it's Trump, but next time it might be your candidate if you're not a Trump supporter, right? So these are tough calls.
No, they certainly are. And a problem that I have with it a little bit is, I really, just to push back a little bit, I really do think there seems to be a propensity to push it towards conservatives. Uh, I think even with this most recent Georgia bill, I mean, I don't know the length of the bill in general. I haven't read the entire thing, and I don't know all the implications behind it. But seeing a lot of people on the left come out and say, "Oh, this is pretty much a Jim Crow era reform," right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
to me, that kind of comes across as, I mean, how is that not fear mongering? And isn't that a little bit insensitive to people who actually lived through Jim Crow era reforms? I mean, a lot of aspects of the bill kind of just have to do with simply returning to a state of voting that was prior to COVID.
Yeah, yeah.
And while we can have disagreements over whether or not those are smart decisions to make, and some of the things that we took into consideration as far as voting goes during COVID might be progress and whatnot, but to call it a Jim Crow era reform, doesn't that kind of, I mean, that's just demonizing an entire aspect of pretty much an entire party, because an entire party is standing behind it.
Yeah.
And going back to January 6th, I mean, I'm in total agreement with you on how, terrible of an event that is. And I think most conservatives, any conservative worth a grain of salt, would agree that that was, an incredibly threatening thing for our democracy. But you know, even back then, there were certain questions that Republicans had about the election. That it was an election that we've never had an election like this before, where there's ballots coming in from all sorts of different directions, and I think there is a little bit of legitimacy as far as questioning, at least bringing it to a court so that people can be heard. Questioning a little bit about the legitimacy of it. I think there's also dangers in that, but to simply shut down the conversation as
Yeah,
I feel that it
but
was done.
nobody shut down the conversation on January 6th. I mean, here's where I really will I think strenuously lay down a marker, right?
Uh,
I mean, the election, like, how many lawsuits did Trump bring? I think the Trump campaign brought 63 lawsuits and lost them all. They won one small little concession in Pennsylvania, but it was a minor concession. And it had to do with both Republicans and Democrats observing the count. That's all it had to do with, which happens everywhere, right? I mean, nobody stopped them from the lawsuits, but the lawsuits were done. There was no more case to be made. There was zero evidence of actual fraud. And so just because the president said there were, that it was rigged,
mm,
which there's no evidence of. And remember, he started saying, I mean, he said that about 2016. I mean, he still claims he won the popular vote in 2016, but he started months before the November election saying that it was going to be rigged, as almost as a way of setting up, like, if he loses, he has an argument to make, right? So the fact that so many people who voted for him believed that it was rigged doesn't make it true. And what you have to look for is the evidence. He brought 60 cases to court. They all got thrown out. He got defeated in all of them. Okay, by January 6th, he had plenty of time to bring the evidence forward and to bring it to a court. None of that worked. It's over, right? But it's not over. He's still, I mean, look, Arizona is holding a new audit. They've already had a hand recount in Maricopa County in Arizona. They've had a federally authorized outside entity do an audit of the vote in Maricopa County, and it's Maricopa because that's where most of the Democratic vote is. But now the state Senate there has hired some fringe cybersecurity guy to run an audit. Who has claimed already on the internet that the election was rigged. So what do you think he's going to find? But I mean, there is just no evidence. So this is an example where, I grant you that if people have some question, they should be allowed to ask it. But I don't think they were not allowed to ask those questions. They brought the lawsuits and they lost. And there was very little, if any, evidence of any kind of fraud. And then by January 6th, okay, it's over. He lost. And in a democracy, the losers have to, it's not the winners who have to agree to the outcome, right? It's the losers who have to say, okay, we lost and we'll give you power until the next election. If the losers don't concede, you got real trouble on your hands in a democracy, right?
yeah.
Now you also raised the thing about Georgia, and I just want to say, I think you're probably right about the rhetoric about, Jim Crow. I mean, Jim Crow was awful. And while I think there are aspects of that law that really are kind of intended to suppress the vote, to call it Jim Crow era is probably an exaggeration. But this is again where I think people on both sides have to sort of say, okay, we have to be responsible for our own rhetoric for sure, but we also have to grant the other side a little bit of, room to exaggerate. It's politics after all, right? There's going to be. So how egregious is that exaggeration? I think people will disagree, right? Some people say, well, it's a bit of an exaggeration. Other people say it's a horrendous exaggeration.
Yeah.
I would agree with you that it's probably an exaggeration.
Yeah.
But I think the real rub there, right, is, okay, so the law passes and there's objections to it, many of which are legitimate, some of which are maybe exaggerated, whatever. And then Major League Baseball decides, we're pulling out. Like, we're not going to have the All-Star game in Atlanta, right? It's a private entity. I mean, they don't want to be associated with it. Home Depot doesn't mind, right? So now they're on the
Right.
right, they're encouraging people to shop at Home Depot. I mean, private entities are going to make these decisions about who they want to be associated with and who they don't. And for Republican elected officials to sort of say, we're going to punish you if you take a political position that we disagree with, because after all, if the political pressure from the left was telling MLB leave Atlanta and they didn't, then that's a political decision too, right? That's a decision to stay there and basically endorse the law.
Right, but don't you think that that's generated from that type of rhetoric? I mean, the reason that the MLB moved it is because of this type of rhetoric of they don't want to be associated with an entire state that's being deemed as racist, or an entire party that's being deemed as racist.
Yeah. I mean,
you talked earlier about you said that people were given a voice after the 2020 election, and I didn't really see that because it immediately started almost pretty much the next day. All these conversations about it was rigged or it wasn't, whatever. But immediately there were people on the right being censored about it. I mean, it was mostly from the media. It wasn't mostly from the government. Maybe they had their say in courts, but you were really demonized as an individual if you came out and said that. I remember being in classes, and if I had even brought that up in a discussion, I would have felt like as though I was alienated simply from that. And I think that that's generated from a culture of, we're free to use whatever rhetoric we want, just like this Georgia bill. And that's what that's doing, is that's bringing corporations into politics, because they have to make these big decisions based on, do I want to be associated with this?
Right.
And I think a lot of times we're over exaggerating like a minor disagreement, and it makes it seem as though our ideological differences are much further apart than they really are.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. I mean, that is a fair point. But I mean, in a way, the rhetoric of a stolen election was just the opposite of what you're complaining about in Georgia, right?
I would agree.
So, well, if there's no basis to it, if there's no basis to the claim that the Georgia law is Jim Crow, well, then what you're arguing is, well, then you shouldn't say it, right? And I think you're right. If it's true that there's no basis to that, and again, I think some parts of the bill are attempting to suppress the vote. Whether I would call them Jim Crow is another issue, but let's assume that is an exaggeration and we shouldn't be calling it Jim Crow. Okay, fine. But, and the ramifications, what you're saying, and I think rightly, is the ramifications of using inflated rhetoric is that you have things like MLB being forced to leave, right? But I would say 100 times worse was the president of the United States saying from the second the election was over, it's been stolen. I mean, there was at that point, you're right, the day after, but at that point, there was they weren't done counting votes. There was no way you could claim fraud within 24 hours, but they were doing it. And what do you think that did in a polarized environment, right? People who support him are more likely to believe it. Just like people who are on the left are more likely to believe that it's Jim Crow in Georgia. So,
right.
You're right. I mean, if we got to dial back the rhetoric, we have to dial it back everywhere. But again, if it's more exaggerated in some places, and I'm not saying it's always more exaggerated on the right, I'm just saying in these two examples, like, boy, the president calling it. Now, Biden referred to the law as Jim Crow, so that's the president. That's fair enough. That's a fair point.
Right.
But man, when the president is saying this election's been stolen, when Rudy Giuliani, his lawyer, is running around having press conferences saying it's stolen, but there's very little evidence. I mean, this is the frustration about election fraud, is that there's just almost no evidence. I mean, do people commit it individually? Yes, every once in a while, but there's never, ever, almost never, there's a couple of cases, but there's almost never enough of it to have any impact on the outcome of the election, right? And so even if somebody voted for their dead grandfather, right, and so they cast 2 votes, right, it's not, first of all, those people are often found out and arrested, but second of all, it's not enough to flip an election, right? So the charges of voter fraud are really, or election fraud are really, really exaggerated.
Well, yeah, I think I agree with aspects of that. I mean, voter fraud in general isn't something that we never see. I mean, throughout the world, it's something that we see time and time again, and in
Well, sure.
certain democracies where elections are rigged and whatnot. I think we just don't ever expect that to be here in the United States. But I think I do agree with your point that Trump coming out and saying that the next day was not something that was positive and not at all something I was for. But my frustration is when it almost seems as though our culture selects I think both sides really do a lot of it. I think, but it's almost always perpetuated towards the right. And I think both parties a lot of times claim to be for democracy and whatnot, as far as the right checking, with this Georgia bill claiming that it's trying to avoid certain things in the future from happening, certain fraud. And then you also see the left right now, or I believe in Congress today, or was it yesterday, that they're voting on adding Washington D.C. as another state. And I think all these different things. I think there's an argument to be made for adding Washington D.C. as a state. I think there's an argument to be made for securing our elections in a better way. But my frustration is that it only ever seems to be politically motivated. Like, I'm not actually convinced that the Democrats are in favor of adding Washington D.C. because they actually want more people to vote.
Yeah.
The thing is, they get 91% of the vote, every single year from there. Of course they want it, Well,
Right.
why don't they call for Northern California to become their own state? They almost never have any representation. They almost, and they're way bigger than Washington D.C.
Yeah.
So I guess
we could break states up all over the place, right? I mean,
Right.
why do we have North and South Dakota? I mean,
Right.
my God, do we need both Dakotas? I mean, come on.
Probably
I mean,
not.
no offense to the Dakotas. I mean, I'm sure it's beautiful out there, but
I think most of the West could be one state.
Well, yeah, but those states were also created for political reasons. If you go far enough back. So, I mean, yeah, and this is the tricky thing about politics, right? And it's why I find it interesting, but it's why so many people find it frustrating, because there is always a political calculation, but that doesn't mean that's the motivation. And one thing I try not to do, and I'm sure I'm guilty of it, but I try hard not to question people's motives. Like, you tell me you're for something or against it, I'll take your arguments for what they are. And I try not to say, well, you're saying you're for it for this reason, but I know you're really for it for that reason, right? Because that, I don't know, I can't get in your mind. So, I think we'd all be better off if we took what people said at face value and said, okay, let's make the argument about Washington, D.C. Democrats probably do favor it because it will help them, and Republicans probably don't favor it because it would hurt them. But let's leave that aside. What are the arguments, right? And I don't know. I mean, in a democracy, to have an entire body of people not have a representative that has voting privileges in Congress just seems ridiculously undemocratic. So on the face of it, that seems like a pretty good argument. Now, let's hear the arguments against it, and let's judge those. And instead of saying, well, Republicans are simply opposing it because they are going to be hurt by it, or Democrats favor it simply because they're in favor of it, right? I mean, because it would help them, right? That's both of those things are probably true. I'm sure they are, but I don't think that should undermine the principles that people might be bringing to bear. And so let's judge those principles again at face value, right?
I certainly, I think I agree with that, and I think that goes a lot back to some of the points that you made in your book, of which I agree with. I think even myself personally, I found myself over the years, especially looking at politicians on the opposing side with a fairly negative view off the bat.
Right.
And that's something that once I realized that made me want to step away a little bit.
Yeah.
And it's something that I think people are just, ideologies can become somewhat of a religion. Like, political parties can become somewhat of a religion for people. And we have something called confirmation bias within ourselves, where we just look for information that approves what we think already.
Right.
And so, I really liked, reading parts of your book where, it made me think, maybe I am not giving politicians enough credit. Maybe they're not all power hungry. And you talked about working on two different campaigns, I believe, in college and in grad school, and saying, these people, they have the overwhelming interest of the people that they're working for in
Right.
mind. They're really not selfish people, because honestly, a lot of times these are really intelligent people who could make money in so many different ways.
Right. Right. Right.
And
And some of them, and
yeah,
some of them are not, right? But I mean,
right,
if you talk to people, especially sort of at the local level, state level, state representatives, I mean, ask them, which is what I often do with politicians, why did you get into politics? Now, granted, sometimes they lose sight of that once they've been in politics for a long time, and maybe there is something to the argument that power corrupts, right? So the more you have power, the longer you've been in office, maybe the more corrupt you become. But I think people enter they wouldn't enter politics to become famous. If you're running for state representative in Pennsylvania, there's 203 state reps in Pennsylvania. You think you're famous? Nobody in the state can name a single state rep, right? I mean,
right.
you're not doing it for fame. You're not doing it for money, right? And you don't have a lot of power even. You're one of
Yeah.
203 people in the state house, right? And there's also a state senate and a governor. So,
Yeah.
I don't think people are entering for bad reasons. Again, they may lose sight of those reasons, but I think most of them don't. I do want to mention something though. I mean, or go back to something you just said, right? Which is ideology can become kind of a religion.
Mhm.
And so here's what's fascinating about ideology. I really, it's one topic that I don't study that closely. I mean, in fact, I'm thinking about a research project that has to do with ideology, but I've taught about ideology a lot, and I'm really fascinated by it. And one of the reasons I'm fascinated by it is because political scientists think, and I agree with this, that ideology is generally a good thing, because what it does is it gives you a kind of framework for understanding politics, right? Without it, you would just be floating around. Like, what would be your way of making sense of politics, right? What are your guiding principles? You'd have none.
Right.
Right? You don't have an ideology. You're just like, well, I hate that person, or I like that person, or this sounds like it's good for me or it's bad for me. Whereas ideology is a little bit more high-minded, right? And it gives you kind of principles and a framework to use. At the same time, the more you're kind of wedded to that ideology, the
Right.
more it becomes a dogma, right? The more it becomes
Mhm.
like a religion. So political scientists, like I said, we think it's a good thing generally that people have ideologies. And yet clearly, if people go too far in their belief of their ideology, that's a
Right.
bad thing, right? So there's kind of this really delicate kind of balancing you have to do with your ideology. It's good to have one, but it's not good to be blinded by
Mm.
it, right?
Yeah, no, that's definitely fascinating, and I think ideologies in general are also something that I love. I like learning about, and kind of because I feel as though I've been in one, and then I've been out of one, and I've moved between a few different ones
Right.
from time to time. But I think the dangerous part of it is when we don't actually acknowledge that it's an ideology, and I think that's something.
Uh,
And I think that that's something I'm seeing a lot in our culture today. Is we all seem like, with religion, for example, like if I'm a Christian, I understand that I'm in this certain conceptual bubble, and I just have certain understandings that other people aren't going to accept. Some of the things that I just accept axioms, like it's axioms I
yeah.
just believe in, right? And I think there's a propensity today where, I mean, we're not really as religious of a society, and maybe it's moving towards politics, maybe it's moving towards, I don't really know exactly, but it definitely seems the case that we don't really acknowledge the axioms we take for granted, and that there's just certain things that other people just aren't going to accept, and I think we understand that when it comes to a topic like religion. Maybe we used to not, but
Oh,
and,
I
and I
don't I don't
I
think
don't think we do though.
I don't think we do. I mean, you say you would recognize those axioms, but you recognize those axioms in your political views too, right?
Right.
You're not the typical thinker, right? You're not the
Mhm.
typical person here. The typical person who's really religious, what do they think about their religion? They think it's
Right.
true,
Right.
right? And that's the same with the typical person who has an ideology. You're
Right.
right to say they don't think they don't call it an ideology, because ideology actually has a
Mm.
bad connotation, right?
Right.
They don't have an ideology, they have the truth, right?
Right.
People
Right.
on the right with a conservative ideology believe that it's just true. And anybody
Mhm.
else must be an idiot, or either
Mhm.
stupid or evil or whatever, right? And the same on the left, and same with religious people. So I think this is the thing about these kind of mental frameworks that we use, right? they give us a lot of grounding. They give us an anchor. They give us a foundation for which to, understand the world, but also to think about how we might want to improve it. Because that's what ideology does, right? It both helps us describe the world, but it also helps us kind of prescribe how we think it ought to work. But that's kind of true for religion too. So I think the analogy is a good one. But I think I wouldn't say that people are sort of more, it's almost like you're saying they're sort of more, what would be the word, kind of self-reflective about their religion and less about their politics. But I think for people who are true believers, both in religion and politics, it's exactly the same kind of process, right? It's I have a window on the truth.
Right.
Everybody else doesn't.
Right. Oh yeah. And I would certainly agree with that, especially when you see like something like whatever religion is based on trying to convince other people. I think that's when you run into problems. We see that with like evangelicalism, trying to almost force other people to come into your belief structure. And I think that I would agree with that. That it's my hope that more people are genuine about where they stand politically. But I think oftentimes the people who are the loudest are those type of almost, I don't want to compare them to like a particular religion, but almost like it's like I have it right and I want to force everybody else to do that. And that might be a product of social media. That might be a product of our times. But yeah, so I definitely agree that ideology has it's got its positives. And I think you really can't separate yourself from that. We're human. We need some sort of space where we're comfortable in, where we can see ourselves within the world. We need that. But what I've come to learn a little bit in kind of almost like analyzing myself is it does a lot of good to step out of it from time to time. Like put yourself in that discomfort zone. And just when we have discussions online, that doesn't happen. Because the people that we interact with, we don't see them as a person. Like if we were talking to somebody in person, we see that they have emotion. They're an individual. But I think online we dehumanize people, and it leads us to getting more ingrained in what we think, and you just see it as, I don't know, we don't see people online as individuals.
Well, and there's no space for doing what you're suggesting, right? There's no space for stepping out and saying, look, I could be wrong here. Like, let me try to be self-critical, right? Because if you did that online, and now you're going to take the daggers from people on your side, right? Who are going to say, what, you're betraying the cause, right? You're not really a true conservative or a true liberal, or true progressive or whatever, right? Or a true Christian or whatever. So you can't play that out publicly online, through social media. And so, this is a whole nother topic, but there's a good case to be made that Twitter, Facebook are really awful for American democracy, right? Because not only do you have to sort of play this two-dimensional role, right? Or one-dimensional role. There's no room for doubt. There's no room for equivocation. But you dehumanize the other person, because I think you're absolutely right. The things you say to people on Twitter or on Facebook, you would never say, most people would never say to somebody else's face, right?
Right.
So it is really those platforms are really, I think, problematic for American democracy, for democracy in general, right?
I would certainly agree. And not only that, but like in YouTube, I find it as well. And a lot of these different platforms, they almost work off of confirmation bias.
Yeah.
Right. Like the more that you look up, the more you dive into what you already believe in, and the more information that you're shown that what you believe is right. So I think it's like, it's kind of a fascinating time period to live in. We've never had this amount of information.
Right.
We've never been able to just have this amount of confirmation that you're right, and then met with such backlash from the opposite side.
Yeah.
And so it makes me think, maybe there is hope if we can recognize this and we can understand, hey, like what we were talking about before earlier, there's people just psychologically, people are going to be conservative. Psychologically, people are going to be liberal. And that's okay. Maybe we can, honestly, I feel as though my position right now is like somewhere in the middle. And maybe that's, a whole different type of psychological person. But I think there's hope to be had, but I think we have to figure out, it's almost as if we're running this experiment that's never been run before.
No, that's right. That's right. And actually, look, there's an argument to be made that American democracy is only about, 50 years old, right? Because if you think democracy requires all adult citizens to have equal political power, that wasn't accomplished until 1965, right? With the Voting Rights Act. certain in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act, right? Until you had full inclusion of the Black population as equal citizens, right? And before that, it took getting women into the system, right? And maybe not even until the early 70s when 18-year-olds got the right to vote, right? But at some point in the 60s, 70s, we really do kind of meet the standard definition of democracy. So it's not that old. You could say we're experiencing growing pains, right? Like we're still trying to figure out how is it that we all kind of do this thing we call democracy. And then when you layer on top of that, Twitter and Facebook, social media, which is obviously only a decade old at most, right? This is all very, very new. So the optimism could be, I mean, I could see an optimistic argument that says, look, we're just trying to figure out how to make this work, right? And so give it a couple more decades and we'll figure it all out. Or you could be pessimistic, right? And say, well, there's nothing guaranteeing a democracy at the end of the day, right? And so maybe people's natural inclination is not very democratic. Maybe we don't like many of us don't like having full equality for all human beings. I mean, it is the case that it's hard to find anywhere in the world a multi-ethnic, multiracial democracy. And by multiracial, multi-ethnic, I mean significant proportions of the population being ethnic and racial minorities, right? There aren't many. And even in Scandinavia, where you had what looked like pretty stable social democracies for a long, long time. Well, yeah, they were pretty homogenous societies, right? And now you've got an influx of immigrants and an influx of refugees. And guess what? All those social bonds are starting to break in Denmark, in Sweden, in other places. So if you wanted to be pessimistic, you'd say, man, maybe democracy is just too fragile. Maybe it can't work. But I'm pretty optimistic too, because I think democracy is actually, it's quite flexible, right? It can adapt and kind of it's malleable. And so you can, no two democracies are exactly the same. And so we can tailor ours so that it works for us. But, that does require everybody agreeing that at bottom, we want a democratic system. And the fear right now is that maybe there's a bunch of people in the society who think, you know what, democracy is not all it's cracked up to be. That's the big fear in all Western democracies, right? There's a whole literature now on what's called democratic backsliding. Political scientists and economists sort of recognizing that, well, look, there are a lot of democracies that have taken steps backwards. I mean, I mentioned Hungary and Poland, but there's a lot more. The Scandinavian countries, maybe, Britain, Western Europe, the United States, lots of places where maybe we're kind of taking a few steps away from democracy. So I don't know. I think we're in a really, we're in a kind of vulnerable moment right now, I think.
I would certainly agree with that. And I think a lot of this kind of goes back to maybe our way forward is, a lot about what you talked in your book is, having that type of gratitude, not being so cynical, not only with our politicians, but even our system. Like as slow moving as it is, it's set us up for a pretty good. I mean, we're pretty well off as far as the history of humanity goes. We're in a pretty much the best spot you can find yourself in. And I think it is an interesting point that you say, that type of backsliding into democracy, and a fear that I have about that is maybe that will push certain people in power to make us more of like, more of a meritocracy type of system, something that you kind of see in China. I've heard people talking about, big businesses and government kind of like, working together because they're fearful of what could happen in the future. Is that a fear is that something that, you've thought about?
Because so the Chinese system you might call technocracy, right? The idea is you're going to be, because I mean, if you look at the leadership in China, I mean, they are almost all trained as engineers, so they're problem solvers, right?
Okay.
And they get promoted. I mean, you're right, merit. It is a meritocracy of sorts, because you rise to the top if you've solved problems locally, right? If you're in charge of a local area and you solve their problems well, whatever those problems might be, crime, pollution, whatever, if you're solving the problems and they've got metrics for how, how well you're doing, then you move up the ladder, right?
Mhm.
And you don't get to the top in that system overnight. There's no
Right.
Barack Obama or Donald Trump becoming president after just a couple of years in office, right?
Mhm.
Or in Donald Trump's case, no years in office. It takes years and years and years to work your way to the top.
Right.
And so the idea is, look, governing is problem solving. So let's get the smartest people, the most analytical people, the engineers, and let them run it. And, there are a lot of people around the world looking at that system going, you know what, maybe that's a good system. I mean, I don't have to worry about it. You don't ask me my opinion. I don't know. I don't care. Just, do I have a job? Is the economy working? Am I safe? That's all I want. And if politicians can provide that for me, I'm willing to back them, right? And so yes, that is a system that I think is I think even more than a normal authoritarian kind of system that we think of as the rival to democracy. I think that kind of technocracy is really the rival to democracy. And
Yeah,
I think, and the danger is that a lot of people who you would think, since democracy is ruled by the people, you would think the people would prefer democracy. But I think there are a lot of people around the world who say, you know what, I don't need democratic rights as long as my needs are satisfied. And those needs get satisfied by technocrats who know what they're doing, right?
Do you think there's merit in that argument?
I mean, there's an argument to be made there. I think ultimately the problem is that a lot of politics is about our values. I mean, what do we prioritize? What are our values? And there's no technocratic answer to those questions. And so, if we're going to decide that we're going to put, our priorities are going to be on a clean environment or more business, even if it hurts the environment, those are value judgments. No technocrat can make that decision. And that's why democracy, I think at the end of the day, is more valuable, because it lets the people who are going to have to live in that system decide where the priorities are going to lie, right?
Yeah, I certainly see
Stuff,
that.
and a lot of the social issues are not really technocratic either, right? I mean, abortion, gay marriage, trans rights, those are not. I mean, there may be technical questions about how to do certain things, but really those are big, broad, moral, value-based questions, and technocracy can't answer those.
Yeah, that's very fascinating.
It's good for the economy. Maybe.
Yeah,
maybe.
that really makes sense. Yeah, definitely. And this comes up in actually a lot of conversations about like science and religion. And this is, I'll cite Jordan Peterson again. My friends will probably make fun of me for doing it, but he said, one thing he talks about is, in the realm of facts and values, like in the realm of facts, science reigns supreme, but it doesn't necessarily in the realm of values.
Right.
And I just think that's a really interesting idea, because, oftentimes that's associated with religion, right? Like there's a big movement to get rid of religion because, science can explain more things now. And, his pushback is, well, it doesn't really explain a lot about where our values come from. And almost in the same sense, I think a meritocracy would take care of a lot of maybe our economic problems. We'd probably be a more prosperous country because of that. But at what cost? At what cost to our values? Like at what cost to our humanity, right? I mean, and I don't know, I think that's just something I find so fascinating. And that's something I've always, I think maybe I haven't, I've thought about this, but not really been able to, put it into words before, is, a lot of times I'm more interested in finding answers that not necessarily like find the best solutions, but protect the dignity of like the human individual in the most sense. And I think a lot of our American values are kind of founded in that sense of like individualism, like, your pursuit of happiness. It's not given to you that we're going to be the most successful country. We're going to all be the most prosperous. It's, well, you can kind of choose your way of doing that. And we see a lot of times the most successful and, countries with the highest GDPs also have some of the highest suicide rates, and sometimes aren't very happy. And so I think these answers, they really aren't found. It's really a complicated thing. And I just find it super fascinating.
It is. I totally agree with you, but I think what I'd say is where it sounds like Peterson is sort of suggesting that the role, that the parts of of society where we have to make these judgments about, morality or whatever. I don't know this for sure because I haven't read Jordan Peterson, but I mean, it sounds like the suggestion is like, well, if it's not going to be science, what's it going to be? There should be a role for religion. I guess what I would say is it doesn't have to be religion, right? It could be science and politics. And
Well,
those
yeah.
ideologies that we've been talking about are the place where we learn what our values are. So, you know, again, you know, we can choose equality, we can choose freedom, we can choose order. You know, we can be more individualistic or more communitarian, right? So there are ideologies that really play up the kind of individualism, but there are ideologies that say, well, look, it's more important that we're part of a community, and the health of the community is what's more important than the happiness or the health of the individual in it, right? Those are huge ideological debates. So we can still have values and a moral perspective that come out of our politics. They don't have to come from our religion, right?
Right. Yeah. And I actually think you would actually probably agree with that. At least what I've read and watched of his lectures and whatnot. It's he's not really, I wouldn't call him like a religious individual, like as far as he's connected to a certain religion. It's more so in the sense of, you know, there's certain things from religious stories, like in all religious stories, and it's something I've become more interested in is learning about different religions and different um, uh, old societies, because even though they didn't have science, they had certain truths about, or relative truths about value and whatnot, and oftentimes in a world dominated by science and, you know, and fact, we oftentimes lose these type of values that we did find in religion. I think that's more what that point is there.
Interesting. You know, what you just said reminds me that, you know, I know that you've always been a really curious person. And I think, you know, I don't know if it's possible to teach curiosity. I think it might be, but I'm not positive about that. But I think one thing that would go a long way to helping solve our problems that we've been talking about, right? This sort of demonization of the other side is to instill more intellectual curiosity. So when you said I've become interested in learning a lot of the stories of different religions, okay, right there, that marks you off as very different from 90% of the people, right? Because most people don't care. You know, either they don't care about any other viewpoints, or, you know, they know, as I said before, they know that they have the truth. So what's the point in looking into other viewpoints? What's the point in looking into another religion? So as soon as you say that, I'm interested to hear what other religious perspectives are. Or similarly, you might say, you know, I'm interested in other political perspectives. Like, why do people see things the way they see them, right? I'm really curious about that. Well, right there, that opens you up and makes you less dogmatic, right?
Right.
And so I don't know how we instill curiosity in people, but we should probably be doing a lot more of that.
Well, I appreciate that, and I would certainly agree with that. And honestly, that's kind of my entire motivation for like doing this podcast
Sure, right.
is honestly, it's not even what it turns into. It's more so it's a chance to, it's almost an excuse to pick people's minds, like pick people's brains who I find have fascinating perspectives. And like, you know, and what other excuse gives you the chance to have an hour and a half conversation with somebody, right? Like there's not a lot of excuses where you could do that.
Right. No, that's why I think it's a great idea. I really
Right.
And it's admirable that you want to do that. And I mean, especially, you know, knowing you as a first year student, right? And knowing that you were thoughtful and smart, but I think pretty set. It felt like pretty set in your views, you know, like you were pretty certain of them. But I think there was always that curiosity and that thoughtfulness, right? So you were like, look, I'm willing to kind of explore my own views, right? And be self-critical and self-reflective. And that's just, most people just aren't that way. And again, you know, do you really deserve credit for that? Or is that just hardwired in you, right? I mean, maybe that's just who you are, you know, that's how you're born. You know, I like to give you all kinds of credit for being that way, but maybe you can't help it.
No, I'll take the credit. No, I'm just kidding. No, but yeah,
it's a good model though. It is a good model. And I think doing this podcast, you know, models it for people, you know, so it's nice.
Oh yeah, certainly. And it's certainly something, you know, I look forward to like continuing this, only the second episode also, but and I think there's also something I've been thinking about, like as far as pursuing, because when you lose, like as you said before, I was kind of set in my ways ideologically, and when you lose that, you almost lose a little bit of your sense of meaning and direction in life.
Absolutely.
And so trying to refine that and rekindle that has kind of been, I think I found it by leaning into the curiosity, which is why I think maybe I am simply just hardwired that way. because it seems to be more natural in that sense. But I think as a young person, I think young people, the more I think about it, I think what we search for the most is an adventure, especially at this stage of our lives. And I don't know, I just wanted to ask you, is that something that you also experienced? And I mean,
Yeah. So, I mean, but I guess what I would say, I think what you're speaking to is identity, right? I mean, when you're a conservative or you're a progressive or you're a Christian or you're, what fill in the blank, it is who you see yourself as, right? It's who you are.
mhm,
And so what you explained about the kind of giving up, a viewpoint, or at least challenging a viewpoint is produces a lot of angst
right,
because it's sort of snapping that identity. It's like, I don't know who I am anymore, right?
mhm, mhm,
um and you might find a new one, and people usually do, right? But often what they do when they've given up one dogma is adopt another one. And we see this in politics a lot. Like, people who used to be like hard leftists in the 60s became really, really right-wing conservatives in the 80s, right? And there was a lot of those examples, because you're just replacing one dogma with another. So
right,
what you've done is kind of, I love the way you put it. What you've leaned into this curiosity. Now your identity is somebody who's seeking, right? Who's
right,
curious, who's
mhm,
always looking and always
mhm,
asking questions and things like that. But not most people aren't going to be comfortable with that. There's an ambiguity there that you have to be comfortable with, that most people won't accept. In my own life, I guess, I mean, I was raised to be fairly religious. I mean, it wasn't sort of a dogmatism. It was more of a practice, and it was part of the identity because so this is a little backstory, but I was, all four of my grandparents were immigrants to the country. They all came from Eastern Europe,
mhm,
from somewhere kind of in what's today is Slovakia,
mhm,
outside Bratislava. Um, and so my parents were first generation Americans. They were both the youngest of very, very large families. And the religion of my grandparents was Eastern Orthodox
mhm,
Christianity. So sort of Russian Orthodox or Greek Orthodox, something like that. So I was raised, as an altar boy in the church. And, there was even a moment where, I mean, I didn't really seriously consider becoming a priest, but I kind of thought that looks attractive. And I realized later that what was interesting about it was reading and writing and giving sermons. And so I just became a professor instead, right? I mean, it's the same kind of thing. But there was a moment in college, and really in grad school, I guess, when it started in college. It actually did start in college in a religion class. I kind of remember now specifically, where I started questioning, my
mhm,
religious views. And that led to a bunch of angst, right? Not just my own, but my family's, my mother's in particular, who was who's to this day still worried that, like, I didn't baptize my kids. And, so who knows what fate is going to befall me or my children because I don't
right,
have that religious belief anymore.
right,
So, that it's very, very, very hard to give up
mhm,
things like that are part of who you are. Even if you don't believe all the tenets, right? You still identify as a Orthodox Christian or as a conservative or as a progressive.
right.
And to some point say, okay, I no longer identify that way. Well, that's a really huge, huge step, and it's hard to do.
No, I certainly agree with that. And I really see a little bit of, I see some similarities in your own upbringing and like your kind of thought process as well. I think I also kind of contemplated some of those same things
Yeah.
growing up, but I think I don't really. Part of the reason that I love, I mean, I really like where I am now. Like, as
Mhm.
I almost identify as somebody who's more curious and in the center. And I think, you said earlier, a lot of people can't do that, and that might be the case, but I almost hope that it isn't the case, because there was a time in my life where I also thought I couldn't do that.
Yeah.
I was like, I will always be this way. I will always think this way because I was
Right.
so convinced of myself. Um, and that's okay, but I found that there is a little bit of anxiety, and it is a little bit difficult when you leave that, but there's also a lot of really cool things. And maybe that's because I'm curious, and maybe because I'm hardwired that way and I
Right.
just
Right.
simply enjoy something like that. Maybe that's why. Or
Right.
maybe there's a little bit of freedom in that, and you can appreciate a lot of different things. I think you appreciate people more. You appreciate ideas more. Um, and I don't know, it just kind of broadens your I found that it's broadened my
Yeah. No, and I hope I'm along with you. I hope that more people could do it. Um, I'm a little bit skeptical that they could, though, because I really do think that, and again, I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not an expert
right.
in the psychology here, but from my understanding of ideology, at least, um, there's just most people won't even entertain it. They just won't even contemplate the possibility that there could be a different way of seeing things than the way they currently do. Now, maybe I'm being defeatist, and maybe if somehow through the education system, if we sort of encouraged it, but conservatives might argue, well, by doing that, what you're trying to do is create the kind of openness to experience that makes somebody a liberal, right? And so that psychological makeup is itself an ideological move, right? So if you wanted to encourage people to question their religion, to question their political beliefs, that in and of itself is a left-wing move. Somebody might argue, right?
Mm,
So I'm skeptical that a bunch of people would, and equally on the left, I don't think a lot of people could even imagine sort of seeing the world in a more conservative way than they do
mhm,
currently, right? So I
right.
just don't know that a lot of people will do it. But it's an interesting question because, and again, I'm not equipped to answer this, but I wonder whether it really does come down to, well, if people are pretty hardwired to believe what they believe, then it's not going to happen, right? And if they're not, then maybe we could get more of that than we think. And so in your particular case, what's really, really fascinating, right, is were you just sort of were you going to end up here all along, and you just were sort of kind of fooled into thinking that you were one way, but you really weren't, and you realized it later? Or were you really set to believe what you were going to believe, and you actively did something to kind of break the whatever you call it, the
Mm,
I don't want to say break the chains, but you know what I mean, like kind of, but really take that leap
right,
that is so anxiety producing.
right.
I don't know.
I don't think I know either.
I mean, it's funny because when you look at little kids are just different in the way they approach the world. Some are
Right.
very cautious.
Mhm,
Some are very skittish and afraid of things. Some
mhm,
are adventurous and jump right in.
mhm,
They'll put anything in their mouth. They're
right.
not cautious at all. I mean,
Mhm.
those things may be really hardwired and may be linked to our political views, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know. I don't know. Along with you, I really do hope people are capable of making those kinds of transformations. And I think what it points to is we have to really try to find a way to cultivate
Mhm.
curiosity,
Yes, and I totally agree with that. And I think
which your
even if
podcast is doing.
yeah, hopefully. And I think even if people are hardwired, I think we could use a little bit more. I think regardless, we could use a little bit more curiosity on both sides. I mean, it's healthy. Everybody should have, like, nobody is fully conservative, like in every single way. Like, we're all very
That's true.
complicated individuals,
That's true.
and I think maybe my goal is to try to tap into that a little bit.
Yep.
Um, but
Yep.
and I guess
That's a really good point. I think
yeah.
you're right about that.
Um, I guess I'll finish it up with a final question. Like, I mean, if you had it your way, like you were at the Constitutional Congress, and you could just maybe restart our entire country, like what kind of I mean, other than the obvious ones, like the inherent atrocities that
Yeah. Yeah.
that were instilled in there, but more so like systematically, what are some things that maybe you would change just in hindsight now that we're
Yeah, yeah. So
250 years later?
I do think it's a good point to say, and it's not just a kind of caveat to say, like, obviously the system was founded in a period of time when it was really undemocratic, and it really set us up for um, not only undemocratic in the sense that not all adults got to participate, but it was based on slavery, and the role of slavery you cannot separate from where we are today. So that's an important thing to acknowledge. But in terms of just the kind of institutional makeup of one thing I say in the book about politicians, and you might not have gotten to this part in the book, but I am a little bit critical of the system, because I think what we blame politicians for is mostly systematic problems, right? I mean, you hear people say all the time, why can't they just sort of, get together and compromise and solve our problems? Well, they can't because of the system. The system is designed to really make a logjam, right? So I think there are too many, what we call, political scientists call, veto points, right? Too many places where things can just fall apart and then you get nothing as a result. So I think I prefer a parliamentary system with something like proportional representation. I think single member districts are a bad idea, because, you know, even in a district that's 90% Republican or 90% Democratic, well, 1 in 10 voters don't agree with that, but that's too bad. They have you know, a representative from the other party. Whereas proportional representation allows many voters, not all of them, but far more voters to feel like they voted for a representative that's there representing them, right? It also would allow for third parties, which I think would be really important. Lots of people say, I'm not a Democrat or a Republican. Okay, well then we need some third parties, right? So I would say a parliamentary, I think presidential system has also got a lot of problems. You know, it just too much power accrues to that one chief executive. So I would just change to a parliamentary system with proportional representation. I think that's the big change.
Yeah, I think I certainly agree with that. I think a lot of our problems are caused by the fact that we are a two-party system. I think if there were more parties, there'd be a lot more. I don't think we'd be as ideologically confined, and you know, there could be a lot more room for conversations and for, you know, reaching across the aisle. And so I think I actually agree with that.
Yeah,
for sure.
And you'd have to be more conscious about your the coalitions that you build, right? Because if, let's say you have 5 parties, nobody has a majority, and you have to cobble together a coalition to have a governing majority, and that means you're going to have to, right off the bat, before you even form a government, you have to you're going to have to do some compromising, right? And so what we do now is we kind of, those compromises are made within one of the 2 parties, and we never see those as conscious choices, right? They just become factions within the 2 parties. So that would make coalition building much more explicit. So yeah, no, I agree. I mean, there is polarization even in multi-party systems, but I don't think it's to the same degree. And so, yeah, no. But again, the important thing about the 2-party system is it's structural. I mean, we get it because we have single member legislative districts. And any, you know, there's a sort of political science law called Duverger's law, which is basically anytime you have a single member district system, you're going to get, there's a tendency, it's not a guarantee, but there's a tendency toward just 2 parties. And so, yeah, so I mean, again, that's to me the root of our problems really are structural, right? They exist because we've got presidency, Senate, House, you know, all these different veto points, single member districts with only 2 parties. Yeah, all those things could be fixed structurally by making some institutional changes.
Yeah, certainly. And I also think, you know, in the beginning, each state almost like represented its own faction in the beginning.
Yeah.
That was kind of like the essence. And now we're not as tied to our state. We're more tied to an ideology or anything else. But yeah, I think that's, I really enjoyed this conversation.
I did too.
This is it's certainly, I mean, I'm still certainly getting used to it. It's it's probably going to take some time, but I really appreciate you coming on. And
well, Calvin, thanks a lot for inviting me. It was an honor to be your second guest. Really nice of you to ask me, and I think it's a great idea. And so I wish you, you know, all the best and a lot of luck with it. I hope it gets a big following.
I appreciate it. I really appreciate it. And I hope, and I wish you the best going forward and everything as well.
Right. Thanks, Calvin.
Thanks so much. You as well.
Right, bye-bye.